Recording started. So again, first of all, we are recording this. So, if you have any questions about that, feel free to send me a message later, but this will be posted on SABR's website on the calendar of events. And thanks for everybody joining us today, SABR Chicago. So we have two speakers lined up. We have Jack Bales and Dan Taylor, and they have two new books, recently new books that we are going to talk about. And so we have a packed agenda today. So we're going to hand it off to Jack first of all. And so you should be co-host, and Dan, you should be set as co-host as well. So you're all comfortable with running your own show. So fantastic on that. And thank you. So again, my name is Bill Perch. I'm the newsletter editor from the Chicago chapter. And I see a bunch of familiar faces and Mark Hoyle, who I just met recently. So glad you could join us today. So had a nice little behind the scenes tour together at the Hall of Fame. So a great weekend over there. So to start off, again, we're going to talk about two books. So first up is Jack Bales, and he is also a member, obviously a SABR member, but he is a member of the SABR Marketing Committee's library subcommittee. So he's helping us do a lot of fantastic work about getting the substantial publications that SABR puts together into libraries and other bookstores. So first of all, thank you very much for all of your work. I know you've done a lot of sort of hands-on digging through some mailing lists, and doing a lot of mailings. So thank you very much for that. Bill. Yeah, so first of all, he will be our leadoff hitter today, and he's going to be talking about his book, The Chicago Cubs Shot for Love, a showgirl's crime of passion in the 1932 World Series. So obviously, when I first heard about this book, instantly, the first images that came to mind for me was The Natural, in a movie that I've loved, and obviously, this story was part of the inspiration behind that. So Jack joins us from the East Coast, but according to the bio, born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and grew up in Aurora, and for more than 40 years has worked on the library side. So welcome, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Bill. Should I share my screen now?
Go ahead.
Okay. And here we go. Okay, here we go. We're all set here. All right. Hello, everybody. And I appreciate being here and being able to talk about what I think is not only a fascinating baseball story about the 1932 Chicago Cubs, but also a terrific tale of true crime intrigue, and topped off with dozens of contemporary photographs. Some of them have never before been published. So, oops. Okay, it's not advancing real well, but I'll try to do it by hand here, I guess. Okay. Anyway, that's okay. Whoops, I want number 2. There we go. That's the one I want. Okay. Let me start out with September 20th, 1932. The Cubs had just clinched the National League pennant with a record of 90 wins and 64 losses, and there were 4 games in front of the second place Pittsburgh Pirates. Okay. And the Chicago Daily Tribune was rather stunned by this accomplishment because the Cubs had to deal with a few major setbacks here. And early on, by the way, it was thought that there was little pitching besides Charlie Root and Pat Malone, but they also had Lon Warnke, who had been a rookie in 1931, and in 1932 had an ERA of 2.38. Team president William Beck wondered about the outfield because of their big slugger Hack Wilson had been traded the year before, but Johnny Moore stepped up and he had 3.08 that year. And the Tribune reported, quote, in this article right here, that never before was a team beset with more irritating experiences apart from the playing of baseball. For example, there was the obvious bad blood between team president William Beck and the team's talented but thoroughly disagreeable manager, Rogers Hornsby. And also the Chicago Daily News, not too many people knew about this, had created, at least now, had created an uproar with his rather unfounded charges of horse race gambling among the players. That was a big thing in Chicago, though it was completely unfounded. And the Sporting News, as you can see here, pointed out that the Cubs season gave the Cubs a, quote, a succession of varied thrills. And tops on the list of both the Tribune and the Sporting News was the July 6th shooting of their star shortstop, Billy Jurgis, in, as the Sporting News put it right here, an episode of unrequited love. So this is a great story, everybody. I just love it, and you won't believe it's eye-popping stuff. And so sit back and relax and enjoy yourself, and let me tell you the story of the girl who shot for love. Okay, and here we go. Okay, the sensational shooting of a popular baseball player by his former lover, Violet Popovich, immediately captured the public attention, and everybody wanted to know what went on in Billy Jurgis's hotel room, room 509 in the Hotel Carlos Hotel. Just a few hours after reporters first learned the news, the afternoon newspapers were on the street, as you can see here, with headlines. And by the way, the Daily Illustrated Times headline is not completely shown here. The entire headline, with the second part in smaller type, reads, Bill Jurgis shot ... by spurned cabaret girl. The Associated Press carried the news across the country, reporting that, quote, a woman scorned almost took the life of Bill Jurgis, star shortstop of the Chicago National Baseball Club. Okay, now you may be wondering, what led me into this story? Okay, as Bill said, I grew up outside of Chicago in Aurora. That's me in the Cubs shirt, by the way. And I've enjoyed researching and writing for many, many years. And after finishing several projects of a kind of a literary bent, mostly for academic presses, I started thinking about something completely different, something for fun to work on. And after learning that not much had been written about the Cubs' early years before they were the Cubs, I immersed myself in newspaper articles, memoirs, archival resources, and other original sources to come up with that particular story. And while working on my Cubs book, I read about the shooting of Billy Jurgis and a few Cubs histories. But they all provided just a few cursory comments, and not really much had been written about it. And so I thought that story was a really interesting part of the Cubs season. I set out to find additional details about this dramatic confrontation in a Chicago hotel room. Now, information about Billy's life seemed readily available, but what about Violet's background, and her family? What did she do with her life after all the excitement died down and newspapers turned to other stories? And of course, what happened to the Cubs in the rest of their season, a season made famous, as you all well know, by Babe Ruth's dramatic called shot home run during the Cubs-Yankees World Series. And slowly the details started to emerge. This was a many-year project, by the way. But I lucked out. The Chicago History Museum, I love that place. This kind of the same thing as Chicago Historical Society. They had the records of the orphanage where Violet and her brothers stayed for a few years. I found details not only about them and how long they had stayed there, but also about their father's lack of support, both financial and emotional too. In fact, I have a letter from from the orphanage's administrator, happened to remark that one of the boys had told him, the father wanted to take the boy from the orphanage, and he told the administrator, no, I don't want to go. This place is the only real home I'd ever known. Newspaper articles provided both day-by-day coverage and interviews with Billy, Violet, and also others, such as the ball players that found Billy after he was shot. And by the way, we have newspapers.com and other databases, but some of these sources don't have the papers for 1932. So I went through every one of the Chicago newspapers page by page on microfilm, trying to find out facts here and there to really flesh out the story of exactly what happened. I also went through Chicago court records. A skilled researcher in Chicago found a lot of these for me, and they were invaluable. Vada's father was physically abusive to his wife. There was a long, dramatic divorce. It was covered by the court system. I found records of that divorce and also a lawsuit involving his second wife. I was also able to interview and correspond with Jurgis and Popovich's family members, and they were very graciously answered all of my questions. So today, here's what I'm going to talk about for the next maybe 40 minutes. I want to talk about the shooting of Billy by his former girlfriend, her court hearing, and a few more details about her rather unhappy early life. Of course, I'm going to talk about the 1932 Cubs and profile Billy's life, and then sum everything up. And along the way, I'm going to show you quite a few family photographs and photographs of Billy too, of course. And a lot of these are in my book, but not all of them. And some of these have never before been published until they were published in my book. Now, on July 1, 1932, the Chicago Cubs were in first place in the National League and they were in the thick of a tight pennant race. And a player who was contributing much to the Cubs' success was 24-year-old Billy Jurgis. Well, 21-year-old Violet Popovich would soon put a stop to that. She had, by the way, she had a stage name called Violet Valley. Just a few days later, she would put a stop to all this. Now, Billy and the other Cubs players were staying at the Hotel Carlos, which was just a couple of blocks north of Wrigley Field on Sheffield Avenue. And here it is right over here. And it looks just like that right now, by the way, too. Well, not exactly like that, but a lot like that. And I'll show you photographs later on. And on the morning of July 6th, Billy was getting ready for a game with the Philadelphia Phillies. And the Cubs were now in third place, 3 games behind the league leading Pirates. At about 9:45 in the morning, Violet called him for her room. This was like a residential hotel, and she was staying there in room 111. Billy was on the top floor in room 509. And she wanted to come up to see him. He told her to come up. And about 10:15, she knocked on his door, room 509, which is at the upper right here, the top floor, upper right. That's Billy's floor. Excuse me, Billy's room. And they had been going out for about a year, but he had recently called things off. They got in a big argument about that, but she still wanted to talk about it all, talk about their relationship. But they ended up arguing some more. And she asked him, a lull in the conversation, she asked him for a glass of water, and he left the room to get it, which has turned out to be a bad move on his part. And here's why it was a bad move. While he was getting it, she pulled a small caliber revolver from her purse. The New York Times wrote that he, quote, made a wild lunge for the gun, and in the ensuing struggle, 3 shots were fired. And one entered his right side, bounced off her rib, and came out his right side, as you can see there. In fact, the doctor said that if it weren't for that rib there, he probably would have died. Another bullet hit him in the little finger of his left hand. A third hit Violet at about the base of her left thumb and traveled up her arm about 6 inches. Fortunately, the Cubs physician, John C. Davis, happened to be in the hotel, and he treated them both, and they were taken to a local hospital. By the way, a lot of these photographs are original wire photos in my collection, except for one that's the original photograph. I'll talk about that in just a bit. And the Chicago newspapers, by the way, pounced on this story, and as they say nowadays, it went viral. It was also somewhat sensational too, because newspapers wanted to sell papers, and Violet was called the dark-haired former chorus girl, the pretty gun-toter, the 21-year-old comely brunette, and the raven-tressed beauty. Photographers even barged into her hospital room to take pictures, as you can see here. This is not in my book, by the way. I thought it was kind of a rather intrusive photo, but I did have the wire photo of it. It was in newspapers all over the place. The caption of this is "Violet dislikes cameras." You can see her bandaged left arm there. And the note in the article that Bill Jurgis, whom she plugged, was in another room. And I said, note her bandaged left arm there. She stayed in the Illinois Masonic Hospital for a couple of days. And here she is leaving for the Bridewell Hospital, right next to the Cook County Jail. She was booked on a charge of assault with intent to kill. And note her bandaged left arm there too. In the meantime, while all this was going on, the police searched Violet's room, her hotel room at the Hotel Carlos, room 111, and they found these 2 photographs there. They also found a note addressed to her brother, Billy. I'm sorry, addressed to her brother, Michael it was, in which she said, quote, "To me, life without Billy isn't worth living, but why should I leave this earth alone? I'm going to take Billy with me. And she later said that this note was the result of, quote, too much gin, and that she only wanted to kill herself to make Bill sorry for breaking up with her. And she said in an interview that when Billy was out of the room getting her that glass of water, she's, quote, I pulled out my revolver intending to kill myself. Bill saw me and grabbed the gun. We fought for it. We really fought for it. The gun kept exploding. I didn't want to hurt him. Now, Violet made the newspapers almost daily, particularly on July 15th, the day of her arraignment. The Chicago, and this is all over the Chicago papers, the Chicago Americans said that when she entered the courtroom with her attorneys, quote, the crowd gasped at her radiant beauty. The Daily Illustrated Times wrote that she was, quote, a symphony in red and white with her red earrings, her red shoes, and her red striped trimmings on her white crepe sports dress, exactly matching her shade of lipstick. And by the way, a Chicago newspaper reporter gave me the original negative from this photograph. He found it, it's never been published. I did give it to a friend of mine who did his book on the call shot. He put it in there, and that was the first time, I guess, and I use it in my book. But I have the original negative in one of those, 4x6, 4x4 negative envelopes. And I printed it. I couldn't believe it. This is the only photograph of Violet, a full body photograph. And I love you can see the bandaged left arm, and there are her two attorneys right there. Now the judge, John SABR, he was not only an attorney and a judge, but he was also the political fixer. The Chicago historian Jonathan Ogg, who wrote a book on Al Capone, wrote a book on Lou Gehrig. He called him, he said he was on the take. And when he was not putting gangsters in jail, he was putting them in coffins. He ran a mortuary favored by Chicago's mobsters who used this garage as a drop-off spot for bootleg liquor. Back in 1928, his mortuary was bombed, and all these reporters were gathered around. They said, well, who did all this? And he said, well, I don't know. I gave some pretty hard sentences, that they must have done it, and they, what's the old saying, some other dude did it, and the reporters just rolled their eyes because they knew it was gangsters that did it. He was kind of with the mob there. But he's also a Cubs fan, and he, like Billy and like the Cubs, they all wanted this to quietly go away. In fact, the judge asked Billy beforehand, what do you want me to do, Billy? And he said, I want it all to go away. And that's what happened. Billy refused to press charges. The judge dismissed the case. And by the way, I meant to show this photograph right over here. I have the original wire photo of this photograph here, and here's the courtroom. There's Violet front and center looking at one of her attorneys. There's Billy hiding his face from photographers. There are flash bulbs going all over the place. Billy's hiding his face. I know there are some ball players there, but I don't really recognize any of them from this photograph. But Violet's mother's buried in here. Some of her Showgirl friends are in the audience here too. This is probably my second favorite photograph here as well. This was a courtroom at that time. And this was July 15th. And on July 22nd, Billy wasn't hurt that badly. He even got shot by 3 times, but thank God that rib saved him. And he felt well enough to take the field in a game against the Pittsburgh Pirates. He played third base instead of shortstop because he would have less stretching to do. The Cubs lost 3-1, but as one newspaper put it, Bill Jurgis, the celebrated revolver target, bounced himself back into his profession by socking a single to center. And this is where it gets interesting. I love what's coming up here. And you will too. Although Billy refused to sign a complaint. No way, I'm not going to sign a complaint. Well, Violet, she said she told reporters, I owe it to my self-respect to stay home for a while with my mom. Well, with my mother. Well, her mother obviously did not provide enough company for her. For just a couple of weeks after the shooting, she signed a contract to perform as a singer in a burlesque club as the girl who shot for love. And the State Congress Theater was a burlesque club on South State Street in a really pretty seedy area of Chicago. It was known for its rooming houses, its dingy pool halls, dingy saloons, burlesque theaters, etc. Interestingly enough, on the very same day that newspapers reported on Billy's return to the ball field, Violet returned to the stage on that day as a singer, and management did its part to attract an audience by booking some, quote, Bear Cub girls as their opening act. And I don't mean BEAR either. And I was fortunate. I loved it. I went through all the newspapers on microfilm, and I loved this ad. And I know who would have buried in the Chicago Record and Examiner. You know, of course, none of this stuff was available online, but I just happened to found it. And all this time, I thought, I want to find a review of the show. What really went on in this show? And so by going through all the newspapers, I found one in the Chicago Daily News, which discussed what exactly went on in their burlesque show, which is what I wanted to find out. And what did Violet do up there on the stage too? She was a singer, by the way. But the degree of nudity for the opening act with the Bear Cub girls all depended upon the applause each Bear Cub girl received from the audience. In fact, I like this whole review so much, I reprinted it in my book. And on top of that was written by this guy named Lloyd Lewis, who's got his own entry in the Encyclopedia of Chicago. He was a very well-respected editor of the Daily News. He was a respected historian. He wrote books on the Civil War. He hobnobbed with all the elite of that time. He was good friends with historian Carl Sandburg, with author Sinclair Lewis, with politician Adlai Stevenson. And oh yeah, he lived in a nice house on the Des Plaines River, designed by his good buddy, Frank Lloyd Wright. And the house is now a National Historic Landmark. Now, Violet's show was supposed to last for about 6 weeks and go all around the circuit there in Chicago. It lasted for only a couple of weeks. And Violet's nephew told me that her singing career really didn't take off because, and that he said her lack of success may have stemmed from her lack of talent. Quote, she liked to sing, he told me. That is, she tried to sing. So Violet was soon back on the stage. And in the 1930s, she was singing sentimental love songs at the Kitty Davis Cocktail Lounge in Chicago. She was also seeing a man named Fred Williams, who worked in the office of his father's hardware factory. And they applied for a marriage license, but they never got married. And by 1940, Violet and her mother moved to Los Angeles to live. By the way, before I get off this slide, you know, the reason this picture is here, because this is in the newspaper under the headline, quote, she finds reason to sing the blues. Well, old Fred here went to the Kitty Davis Cocktail Club in 1937 to pick Violet up from her act. And he was really annoyed because she wasn't done yet. She was still singing. She had to change her clothes. They got in an argument in the car. And then he started speeding down Chicago streets, yelling at Violet, going through stop signs, going through stoplights. She was yelling at him, stop the car, let me out, let me out. And he said, quote, you want to get out? Oh, okay, I'll let you out. And as she told a policeman, quote, while the car was still going, he opened the door and he pushed me out. And Violet suffered a few scrapes and bruises. They apparently, though, made up a little bit because just a few months later, they applied for a marriage license. So Violet had her share of difficulties even after all this. And she had a bad early life too. And a few years ago, Violet's nephew, Mark Prescott, the son of her brother Mark, he learned of my research and he contacted me and he offered family photographs, his own personal insights. He knew Violet very well. And with some more research, additional details emerged about the sad, strange saga of Violet Popovich. And these details also provided insights into what may have led to her decision to confront Billy Jurgis in his hotel room on July 6, 1932, and pull a gun from her purse. And this, by the way, is my favorite photograph of Violet in the early years. She looks like a nice, a sweet person, a nice person. And, too bad she had to there's a little matter of a gun, but, it looks like she had a great life in front of her in this photograph. But anyway, little did we know. After my book had gone to press, Mark Prescott gave me this photograph on the left. And I really wish I could have used this in my book. It's the only known photograph of Violet's dad, and that's him right there. He was an Austrian immigrant who came to the United States in Ellis Island in 1907. He was an electrician by trade. He moved to Chicago and married another Austrian named Margaret Heindel. They had 4 children, of which Violet was the oldest. Now, the marriage was not a happy one. When Violet was only 10 days old, he began beating his wife, giving her black and blue marks. And the couple divorced in 1920 on the grounds of, quote, extreme and repeated cruelty. In fact, 8-year-old Violet even had to testify at the divorce hearing. How traumatic that must have been. Child support was very slow in coming, even despite Michael Popovich's very lucrative income. And for a few years, Margaret had to leave her children at the Ulick Children's Home there in Chicago. It's still there, run by the Lutheran Church. And there they are, the 4 boys standing right outside it. Violet disliked living at the orphanage, and in 1926, and I found this in the records of the society too, shortly before her 15th birthday, she told the administrator she was 18 and she wanted to leave. Apparently no one verified her age, because at age 15, she walked out the door and went back to live with her mother. Just a few months later, she probably had second thoughts about that, because she ran away from home because her mother punished her for going to a movie with a boy and staying out late. The police were called to find her, and there at age 15, Violet made her first appearance in the Chicago Daily Tribune. Now, Violet said in interviews that she was married at a young age, but that it was a very short marriage. I was unhappily married at 18, she said in an interview, one of those puppy love affairs with a schoolboy. I never lived with him, and we were divorced 6 months later. Now, right after her divorce, she enrolled in a dancing school there in Chicago. And in early 1930, she joined the chorus of a Chicago production of Vanities. This is a big, big deal in New York, Vanities. Earl Carroll was a big, big deal himself, the ultimate political showman. But at that time was famous for his elaborate shows at his scantily clad showgirls. And in this souvenir pamphlet here notes that the show was, quote, America's greatest review. And the motto of Earl Carroll was, quote, through these portals pass the most beautiful girls in the world. And Violet was in the Chicago production. In the summer of 1931, she enrolled in dancing school in 29, went in the show in 1930, and in the summer of 1931, she met Billy. As she said in an interview, quote, Bill is the boy and 100,000 for me. I met him at a party, and if it wasn't love at first sight, it was just about second. And a year later, the two of them had their dramatic meeting at the Hotel Carlos. And then she sang at the burlesque show. She sang in the nightclubs. And as I said before, she moved to Los Angeles in 1939, 1940. We'll continue with Violet, but let's get back to the Cubs for a little bit. And here we go with the Cubs infield. Some of you Cubs people, I know Ed Hardig's here, my friend Ed Hardig, and that's Woody English, Billy Herman, Charlie Grimm, good old smiling Stan Hack, and of course, Billy. Billy, as I said, joined the team on July 22nd, and after their loss to Pittsburgh that day, they found themselves 3.5 games behind the league leading Pirates. And everyone was under a lot of stress, of course. And on top of that, there were all these whispered comments in the Chicago organization, which centered on the obvious animosity between club president William Beck and their thoroughly disagreeable manager, Rogers Hornsby. Now, Beck believed that the team was easily good enough to win the National League pennant, and he was growing darn sick and tired of Hornsby's constant complaining about the men and their alleged shortcomings. The players, too, had little use for Hornsby. Quote, he was one of the greatest hitters that ever lived, perhaps the greatest, said second baseman Billy Herman and future Hall of Famer Billy Herman, but he never talked hitting with us. He just expected you to go up there and do it. Things continued to get worse. A loss to the Brooklyn Dodgers on August 2nd put the team 5 games behind the first place Pirates. And that evening, Beck fired Hornsby and appointed as manager the popular first baseman and team captain Charlie Grimm. He's also known as a left-handed banjo player, as you can see from the dust jacket of his memoir. And Grimm lived up to his nickname, Jolly Charlie, and the team flourished under his easygoing management style. It's back to Billy Herman here. Quote, he just let everybody go their own way. Remember Billy Herman? No rules, no curfew. He ran the game on the field, of course, but away from it, he was just one happy-go-lucky guy. Club president William Beck was really concerned, of course, about Billy's recovery right after the shooting. And he was also concerned because of the loss of player manager Rogers Hornsby. So you got two people here he's worried about. So Beck brought in infielder Mark Koenig. I hope I pronounced that right. I've seen it Koenig, I've seen it Koenig. I'm going to say Koenig. I saw it there more times than Koenig, to help out as shortstop. And he used to play with the Yankees. And he proved to be an excellent choice as he helped the Cubs clinch the National League pennant, as I said before, on September 20th. But all in all, it was a really tough season for the Cubs. And as the Chicago Daily Tribune said, it was just one thing after another. You got Hornsby's dismissal, and you got Billy Jurgis's shooting, and of course, I'll get to later, these charges by the Chicago Daily News. But throughout it all, the Cubs managed to prevail, due in large part to the hitting and fielding of Mark Koenig, who batted .353 during the 33 games he played for the Cubs from August 14th to the end of the season, September 25. I think Billy played in 153, or maybe it was 155. Mark played in 33. The reason I bring this up, because this is important, because each team was going to get a share of the World Series bonus money, and the players got to vote on how much each person got. It had to be unanimous too. And that's the problem, because two players, they were Billy Jurgis and Billy Herman, voted not to give Mark a share of the World Series receipts. And even though they admitted, I read in the book Wrigleyville, which is an oral history of the Cubs, he says, sure, one of them said he won the pennant for us, but he only played in 33 games. And so they voted him a half share. Of course, the New York Yankees, Mark's former team, and Chicago's World Series opponents they didn't see it that way. And when the newspapers announced the World Series breakdown of the money, the Yankees and Babe Ruth, the Yankees in general, and Babe Ruth in particular, blasted the Cubs as penny pinchers and cheapskates. And as Babe Ruth said, quote, I hope we beat them 4 straight. He admitted scornfully in an interview. They gave Koenig a sour deal in his player cut. They're chiselers, and I tell them so. Okay, as famed Washington Post sports writer Shirley Povich wrote, who, by the way, is the father of the talk show host Maury Povich, the Cubs' stinginess fired the Yankees to new heights. And the Cubs were down 2-0 in the World Series when Game 3 was played in Chicago. Insults have been flying back and forth between the two teams during the World Series. And in the 5th inning, the score is tied 4-4. Ruth was at the plate facing pitcher Charlie Root with a count at 2 balls and 2 strikes, and Babe Ruth, as you all know, raised 2 fingers of his right hand. Did he signal that was 2 strikes? Did he gesture contemptuously to the Cubs in the third base dugout, or did he gesture to Charlie Root, the pitcher, or did he point to center field as if to signal that he was going to hit a home run? And that is, did he call his shot? And what person saw, as best as I can tell, what person saw, depending upon where they were sitting and the angle of that view. And this is even borne out by the home movies that were taken at the game. They were of little help. And that Robert Kramer, in his biography of Ruth, goes into that. But in any case, Babe Ruth did indeed hit a home run. Lou Gehrig followed that with a home run of his own, and the Cubs lost that game 7-5, and the following Game 2 was a thoroughly demoralized Cubs lost the World Series to the New York Yankees 4 in a row, just as Babe Ruth had hoped. And they didn't even win 1 game. Now, of course, whether Babe Ruth called his shot has been debated ever since October 1, 1932, when it happened. In fact, there've even been books written on the called shot. But what I found out, and from what I looked in the original sources, is that whether he did or did not, do not fall along the partisan lines, because I found Cubs who just really emphatically said he pointed. Guy Bush in particular. Guy Bush was probably Babe Ruth's principal heckler, and he maintained he was pointing to center field. Charlie Grimm said he did, but then he changed his mind when his book came out, I noticed. But then there were Yankees who just as emphatically said he did not, that they all recognized it was a good story, and they decided to all keep quiet. Frankie Crosetti was one of them. I saw an article about Joe McCarthy, who just matter of factly said, oh yeah, we that's a game in which he pointed to center field. Of course he didn't do that, So I saw him both ways. But of course, reporters picked it up after Joe Williams of the New York Herald Tribune, New York World Telegram, excuse me, said that Ruth calls shot in his article about the game. Now, according to the hard-nosed Charlie Root, he said that if Ruth had indeed tried to show him up by signaling where he was going to hit the baseball, quote, anybody who knows me knows that Ruth would have ended up on his ass. Of course, I can't. He said that later on, but that also would have put Ruth on base with Lou Gehrig up to bat. So I wonder if that's really true. But anyway, Charlie Root, by the way, brooked no interference on this topic. He was offered to play himself in the Babe Ruth story, given a fee, but he refused, saying that not if you're going to show him pointing. This is my favorite story. During a Root family outing one day, the whole Root family was playing a game of wiffle ball, and Charlie Root naturally was pitching, and Charlie Root's wife made the mistake, you can see where I'm going with this, of taking her wiffle ball bat and pointing to the outfield with it. And old Charlie Root wound up and smacked her right on the neck with the ball, knocking her to the ground. And the whole subject rankled him to the rest of his life. Right before his death, he told his daughter, I gave my life to baseball, but I'll only be remembered for something that never happened. But as Robert Kramer, and as I say in my book, what does it matter? Whatever happened, only Babe Ruth, with his extraordinary power, his presence could have transformed a few minutes of baseball into American legend. And even as Charlie Grimm said, quote, right after the game, he said this, a great guy hit that homer, the greatest slugger of all time. Now, after Billy got shot, he told a reporter, I'll probably never get married. Well, no, he changed his mind a year later. He married Mary Hewitt, I think her maiden name is pronounced, of nearby Birdsboro on June 28th. And one sports writer said that she must have provided him with, quote, inspiration, because on that wedding day, he celebrated his wedding with a doubleheader with 6 hits in a Cubs-Phillies doubleheader, which they won. He got a home run and 5 other hits, 2 games that Chicago won. And as I think that, of course, he could not have celebrated his wedding in any better fashion. I'm going to discuss the rest of Billy's career in my book, including his rather disastrous 59 and 1960 season as Cubs manager, as Boston Red Sox manager. He said later on, after he got fired, he told an interview that when you become a manager, you have to have a team that is coming up. All my players on the Red Sox were finishing up their careers, and there was not much I could do here. And one of those players was a mighty left fielder, Ted Williams, who in fact retired in 1960 and couldn't help Billy much. He and Jurgis got along really well. They really hustled. Of course, it was said that back at that time, the Boston Red Sox really weren't into hustling. In fact, there was an anonymous article in the Christian Science Monitor from someone who said that what this club needs is a good shaking up. And that was rumored to be Jackie Jensen, shown here, who was just a superb player in his own right. He led the American League with his 112 runs batted in 1960. Jurgis retired in 1960, and so did Jackie Jensen too. And so they really couldn't help Billy too much. Billy did his best, but he was let go in June of 1960 with a very disappointing major league management record of 59 wins and 63 losses, a winning percentage of just .484. But he finished his career as a very well-respected coach, baseball scout and instructor, minor league coach too. He quit the baseball life in the early 1960s to take care of his ailing wife, Mary, who died in 1984. He later remarried, and as he put it, he and his wife Phyllis, quote, enjoyed the good life in Largo, Florida. There's a park nearby. They played pinochle, they danced, they played cards. He visited with ball players that would live nearby, and he socialized with teammates at various baseball functions. Although Billy was not a powerful hitter, he compensated for that with his very solid defensive skills. In fact, during his 17 years in the major leagues, from 1931 to 1947, he led the National League shortstops in fielding percentage 4 times, 1932, 35, 37, 39, and once in double plays turn, 1935. He batted .258 in 1,816 games and collected 1,613 hits. He was diagnosed with cancer in 1991. He entered the hospital in early 1997 and died a few weeks later on March 3rd at age 1888. As he said before he died, he said, Cubs, Giants, good year or bad year, I've never failed to do my best to play out to the limit. Baseball has done well by me. I've done all I could for baseball. I interviewed both Billy's daughter and his grandson extensively, the grandson, and I asked his daughter whether she knew about the shooting, and she said, quote, that she knew about the incident, but that when she was growing up, quote, it was never mentioned in our house, never. As I said, I love these photographs here, by the way. I love the one about it of her cape here. She wanted to be a singer. She's moved to LA in 1940 with her mom, and she wanted to be a singer. So she had these promotional photographs taken of herself. Despite the glamour shots, she never really made it on the stage, never really had an opportunity to launch a West Coast singing career. A couple of these are in my book, I know. She was a city person. Her 1947 marriage to boxer Charlie Retzlaff, a prize fighter from Duluth, Minnesota, probably never should have, it was probably doomed from the start. He was the Duluth Dynamiter. He was a pretty good fighter until in 1936, he made the mistake of getting into the ring with a young Joe Louis. You know, you can imagine what that happened. It was not a pretty sight. He lasted a few minutes into the first round. Their marriage did not last long, but they remained friends. They did not divorce. And I go into more about this with Bada's other relationships in my book. She was certainly not at a loss for male companionship. Movie star John Wayne tried to pick her up at a nightclub one time, took her home. He did not go inside, though. He wanted to go inside, but Bada's mother was waiting up for her, and so he kind of just dropped her off and went home. But Bada's nephews share with me stories about their aunt, and one of them told me that she had overheard his mother talking to Bada about the shooting. Remember when Bada said that, she changed her mind and said that she only wanted to kill herself? No, that wasn't it. Mark overheard Bada talking to his mother about the shooting, and she said, quote, I was very angry and I just wanted to kill him, or I wanted to shoot him. No, I wanted to kill him, I think he said. It's in my book, the exact quote, but I think he said I wanted to kill him. The other nephew, Michael, told me, she said, Violet was easygoing and upbeat. Her interests were, she was never depressed or melancholy. She had friends. She was sociable. Her interests were baseball and movies. She struck me as a very normal person, and I had no idea she had shot the 1932 Cubs shortstop. She spent her final years in a nursing home. She did not have much money, but she enjoyed regaling staff, visitors with tales of her showgirl past. She had an upbeat attitude. She died on February 25th, 2000, and was buried in Los Angeles's Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills. Billy was 88. She was 88. I discuss in my book that, like Violet, the Hotel Carlos had a share of tough times. Over the years, the residential hotel gradually fell into disrepair. You can see the air conditioner up here, and that trim's all falling apart. You know, looks like the paintings fading over here. These crummy looking blinds. I interviewed Ed Hardig about the Hotel Carlos one time, and he told me that when people, Ed told me he walked across it, he walks by on his way to work, but he said people would often cross to the other side of the street when walking by it. It was so run down, and I thought that was a great line. But here we go, a real estate company purchased it and completely remodeled it and renamed it as a 3834 North Sheffield. And there it is, how it looks right now. And Billy's room is still up there. And on their webpage, they say that the quote, they called it the once hip apartment hotel for Cubs players, but now it was offering studio apartments for upscale professionals. Just one more note. In 1949, 19-year-old Chicagoan Ruth Ann Steinhagen, who had to quote the New York Times, a twisted fascination with former Cub and then Philadelphia Philly Eddie Waitkus, shot him in his hotel room at Chicago's Edgewater Beach Hotel. And ironically, Waitkus and Jurgis had played together for a couple years, and Waitkus had hit a double in Billy's last game on September 9th, 1947. And author Bernard Malibin never mentioned where he got his source material, but it seems likely that one or both of the shootings inspired him to include a passage in his 1952 The Natural, in which a woman shoots ball player Roy Hobbs. And The Natural and that scene continue to live on today, thanks to the hit 1984 motion picture starring Robert Redford as Hobbs. By the way, Ruth Steinhagen died in 2012, but her death went unnoticed for about 2 weeks before reporters noticed it. Then it was all over the Chicago papers. And I researched that shooting too, and I got her address, I got her phone number. I tried contacting her, not by phone. I didn't have enough nerve to contact her by phone, but I did write her 3 times and close a self-addressed stamped envelope. Never heard from her. Eddie Waitkus' biographer said he had the same reaction. I have a few minutes left. I want to touch upon one. I'm looking at the time here. Give me 5 more minutes here. I mentioned the unfounded gambling charges that with Roger Hornsby. Well, after he was fired on August 2nd, the Cubs players were both relieved and worried. Relieved that he was gone, but they were worried because he owed them money. And it turns out that Hornsby had often bet on the horse races, and to cover his gambling debts, he had borrowed thousands of dollars from infield Woody English, coach Charlie O'Leary, and pitchers Guy Bush, Pat Malone, and Bob Smith. The Chicago Daily News had a different take on it. On August 11th, it reported on, quote, a sweeping inquiry into charges of horse race gambling by the players during Hornsby's term as manager. Manager William Beck was livid. He called the story, quote, one of the most outrageous incidents in baseball history and a cheap, cowardly attack. Well, it all had to be checked out, of course. And the man for the job was Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And on August 11th, he reported, he tested the players, the men all testified before them on a special hearing on August 13th, which was well publicized in newspapers. And he cleared all the players of all charges except for Hornsby, who did indeed gamble in horse races. He had borrowed some $11,000 from the men, of which he said rather incredulously during all this testimony, which was quoted verbatim in Chicago's papers, to pay back taxes and the mortgage interest on his home. And a total of $6,000 have been paid back, and he made an agreement with President Beck as to how the rest of the money would be repaid. Let me end on something of a light note here. I've gotten to know Chicago Cubs historian Ed Hardig pretty well. We've never met, but we've emailed for years now, many times. I quote him in my other Cubs book, and I quote him a lot in this Cubs book too. And we both agreed that except for her decision to pull a gun out of her purse on July 6, 1932, Violet seemed like a pretty nice person. All she wanted, and Ed and I talked about this, was a solid, stable relationship and some security, unlike what her family provided. But on the other hand, there was that little matter of a gun in her purse, packing heat there. And Ed and I both agreed she's kind of a rather sad character in Cubs history. Now, I've enjoyed all this research a great deal, a heck of a lot. I've had a lot of fun with all this. And one time in the email a few years ago, I told Ed, Ed, Violet's kind of like a member of my family. And I'll never forget Ed's email in which he wrote back something like, wait a minute, Jack, maybe it's time for you to take a break for a while, step back from the microfilm, take a drive, turn your computer off, do something else for a while. And I suppose Ed had a point, but Violet's going to be around for a lot longer. But anyway, a few months, I'm doing podcasts now, and I'm really trying to promote this book. But a few months after Ed gave me this very, very good advice, Ed, I know you're watching here, but I decided to really make Violet a part of my family Christmas card. So with my son and my daughter and me, and there we go. And note, and this, I sent this out to all my friends, and note the bandage on Violet's arm. It says, my sister did this for me. It says, Violet, I hope you feel better soon. Go Cubs, Jack. Thanks very much, everybody. Okay.
Great, thank you very much. So that's a wonderful presentation and fantastic research. So I'd like to open it up to questions. If anybody has, go ahead, unmute yourself. I did see one comment in the chat, and it just said, Jack, who paid for Violet's attorneys at the trial?
Oh,
one was James W. Burke, who was a top lawyer and very expensive.
That's a good question, and I never thought about that, and I've never came across it. I know she was in the hospital, and her hospital bills were paid by a person in her church, the Lutheran church. And I couldn't get into this. I didn't have time to go into this by going into this in my book, but this was her bail bondsman. It was also a member of her church, and he stole her love letters. And he wanted to blackmail both Billy and Kai Kyler, the married Kai Kyler, whom she had dated a little while ago, not knowing he was married. She said she had all these love letters. He stole that. Well, she gave them to him for safekeeping, and he kept them. And first, he told her that he wanted to print them in a souvenir book and sell them at ballparks and call that as love letters of a shortstop. And but he really wanted to blackmail both ball players. This went back to court in Judge Sabarborough's courtroom, and finally she got all her love letters back. But there was a big thing in the press at that time. But and she went to court a number of times to get her love letters back. Maybe the bail bondsman paid for the attorneys, but I've never came across any. And I went through all the articles, and I never really saw any mention of it. Though I do know the bail bondsman paid for her hospital visit. So maybe he paid the other cost too, or maybe they did it gratis knowing that it was a big story. That's a great question. And I have to admit, I never thought of it. And I did not know that the attorney was a big wig attorney and was very expensive.
It'll come out in the sequel, right?
Yes, it'll come out in the sequel, right? Great question. Thanks for asking. I'm going to remember that. Maybe I'll try to find something on that.
Perfect. So yeah, feel free. If you have any questions, go ahead. We'll take a couple of minutes, unmute yourself, and ask directly.
Yeah, this is Richard.
Hi, Richard.
Jack, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I thought it was great.
Thank you, Richard.
I can only offer a little footnote here that I think you'll appreciate, having written the previous book about the Cubs, that with Violet having grown up at the Ulick home. The Ulick home is related to the Ulick family, and they had a big estate actually on the south side of Chicago, where, and it's even mentioned in your book that there was a prime meeting, and this dates back to the Excelsiors, but when they were trying to rejuvenate the Cubs at the Ulick Hotel, the hotel was on the estate. And in fact, all the land around there was on it. So where the Excelsiors built their original park in 1868, and then later where the 23rd Street grounds ended up, that was on what was the Ulick estate.
I had no idea that was that.
Yeah.
I had no idea. Thanks for telling me that, Richard.
Yeah, so there's a link there. But great presentation.
Thank you very much. By the way, if anyone wants to get a copy of the book through Amazon or whatever, I'll be happy to send you. I have all these neat book plates designed with the cover on the book plate. I'll be happy to sign one and inscribe one and send it to you. Just email me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to that. So I'll email you after. So
yeah, yes, Bales at umw.edu. UMW is University of Mary Washington, where I went to school.
Great, perfect.
In fact, it's right over. Yeah, there it is, right there.
Perfect. Yeah. So any other questions? Go ahead. And,
I'm keeping it to the time limit too, which is good.
No,
I had to run by that.
A little flexibility.
Okay, because I had to run by I wanted to spend some time on the gambling part, but I know I kind of covered that rather quickly there.
Oh no, absolutely. More incentive to read the book, correct?
Yeah. It's a neat story, you know. And I mean, I said I've done radio shows, I've done podcasts, and the person who did the book, The Call Shot, I know, Bill, you have that book. He and I are good friends, and I wrote a blurb for his book, and he gave me some of the list of contacts he did to promote his book. And so I'm writing these radio shows and podcasts. And I've a guy who did a podcast called History of Go-Go out of Quincy, Illinois. In fact, that's on their webpage now. He invited me to give a talk in the spring he's head of the local historical society. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to, and just like I did on this marketing committee, I'm contacting Illinois libraries to see if they want to get a copy of the book too, you know, so I'm doing all I can to promote it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's another quick comment in the chat. Bought it from Mike Hoppard. Bought it, read it, and loved it. Thanks for writing the book.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I saw you were there, Mike. Mike and I go back quite a few months too. We've talked about. We're both interested in William Hulbert in the 1876 Cubs, and I did a presentation for the 19th Century Committee on that, and Mike was in the audience, and we've spent a lot of time talking about that. That's great.
Excellent. And then I know you mentioned Ed Hardig. I do have to say, we haven't had a chance to meet either, but every single issue of our chapter newsletter, you're the first person, or Richard Smiley, who nails our scoreboard puzzler. So I'm always blown away about how quick one of the two of you respond to that. So incredible sleuthing on some of those historical photos. So
also, SABR member Ray Cush, I don't know if he's here, but I invited him. He edited my manuscript page by page, putting over Ray Cush is his name, went over each page with all these pencil notations, and I owe him a great deal too. He really did a lot of work for me.
Jack, who was the publisher? Were there any?
The publisher is the History
published?
Press, Arcadia. Arcadia is a parent press, but the History Press did it. You know, it's loaded with photographs. It has 50 photographs in it, and it's just a lot of fun. It really reads well. I've had people who are not baseball people said, "My God, Jack, this is such a..." And I worked hard to make it really flow, not as kind of an academic book, but just it's a neat story. I really think it's a good story.
Yeah, and I think too, what's compelling about this is the story. You don't necessarily need to be a baseball fan. I mean, I think it's just an intriguing story anyway. So it's just a little more exciting when you know baseball and the history. And what I was always blown away with too is this is happening when the Cubs are fantastic. It's not weird era where they're just sort of floundering. They're National League contenders during this long stretch. So that makes the story even more compelling. So excellent.
Hey, Jack.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There you are. Yeah.
Mention some of the other people that Violet dated.
Well, you know, that's a good question, Ed. She dated, Billy, of course, and she also dated the ball player, Kai Kyler, and he was married at the time. But then she said she dropped him when she found out she was married, and later on she was oh God, I have a senior moment, Ed. Who's the White Sox manager?
Al Lopez.
Al Lopez. Yeah, she was dating Al Lopez when he was White Sox manager, and she was also dating Leo DeRocher as well. So I think that's a great trivia question. You know, who dated both managers of the White Sox and the Cubs? Not at the same time, I gather. But Leo DeRocher, I think she dated him early on, and then later I know she dated. She did date Leo DeRocher early on in the 30s, and then Al Lopez later on. In fact, Mark Prescott told me that he was watching the game with Violet. I think it might have been 12 years old in the stands, and Al Lopez came up to the stands with a signed baseball to give to him, and he still has the baseball. But Leo DeRocher, Al Lopez, Kai Kyler, and Kai Kyler was married, and I found out that he was kind of a ladies' man. In fact, Billy, he was interviewed by Jerome Holtzman, and he said that Kai Kyler was kind of a ladies' man at the time too, even though he was married. But Violet supposedly dropped him.
So she dated 3 Hall of Famers.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So next year when the
make
Cubs
appearances for the Cubs?
No, the Cubs wanted to kind of put her on the, kind of like got rid of her. One time, and I think I have this in my book, after the shooting, the Billy Jurgis and I think it was Guy Bush, they were in a bowling alley and they saw Violet from far away and they couldn't push each other fast enough to get out of there. Guy Bush says, we ran out of there like a rocket, when they saw Violet there.
So next year when the Cubs do their 6 degrees of players connecting 2 players, they can all go through Violet now.
Yeah,
which I'm sure they will.
See what happened too. I didn't get into this, but when the Cubs, I think they were playing Brooklyn, and as Violet said in her letter to her brother, she had said gossips began to cast aspersions on my character, meaning they were kind of whispering comments that she was dating other people, which I think she was, but she wanted to prove she said she wanted to prove to Billy that she loved him and only him, and that's why she only wanted to kill herself. But she really wanted to take him out too, but
yeah. So
wonderful.
Bill, you really think on the scoreboard they're going to put, this guy who, had, played with Ty Kyler, who dated Violet Popovich, who shot Billy Jurgis, who,
who knows? We'll
do
see.
graphics with the shooting, at least,
Actually, I know, and the answer is no.
but Mark Prescott told me that John Wayne was a real ladies' man too, and he really had his eye on Violet, which is why he took her home. But Violet's mom, Mark had a good time telling me about that. He said, "Oh yeah,
yeah." Well, I mean, same thing with DeRocher. I think it would be easy to list who DeRocher didn't date.
Yeah, and I think it was yes, exactly. And I think it was 1961. Violet and Charlie Retzlaff had Thanksgiving dinner at Mark Prescott's house. And Violet cheerfully informed them that she and Charlie had spent that afternoon sunbathing nude, and Violet and Mark's father just hit the roof. And she said, I think Mark told me, he wrote me, it says, words went flying. Charlie got so embarrassed, and I was embarrassed too, something like that. She was matter of fact, said, oh yeah, we sunbathed nude all afternoon, and.
Fascinating. Well, perfect. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's an outstanding book. If you haven't had a chance to get it, I definitely recommend it. And again, Jack, you mentioned you can get a customized nameplate. So
yes. Mm-hmm.
So it definitely we'll be able to reach out to you. So I thank you very much. And again, if you have any other questions, we can open it up at the end after Dan's portion. So thank you again. And without further ado, I guess we will hand it over to Dan. So you go ahead and you can take control of the screen.
Okay, I'm going to close this out. Oh, there we go.
Well, I'm Bill, thanks for the invite. I'm good. I'm just going to do it myself here. So you're stuck with my mug. But first off, Jack, congratulations on your book. And what a terrific presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Wish I'd won that coin toss and gone first. It's fantastic. I don't have any stories about nude sunbathers or anything, but we are going to talk about a lot of celebrities.
Great.
And talk about the Hollywood stars. For me, the opportunity to do this book, Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball, came as a result of an earlier book I did when I was asked to collaborate with the iconic scout George Genovese on his autobiography, A Scout's Report. And George and I spent a lot of time together, became great friends, went to a lot of ball games and spoke regularly. And George had played for Hollywood in 49 and again in 51. And when he talked about that time in his life, his stories were not just a former player telling stories. We might be at Dodger Stadium, for instance, and George would point something out, or I might mention something and he would say, well, we started that at Hollywood. Or we'd be watching a game on TV, something would pop up and George would say, well, that was something we started at Hollywood. And in talking to some friends that were pretty avid baseball historians, I mentioned some of these things to them. They had no knowledge of it. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. Somebody at Hollywood was pretty innovative and has never gotten credit for it. So next thing I know, like you, Jack, the sleeves are rolled up and it's a deep dive of research, which is fun. I love it. It was fascinating. It was very rewarding and fulfilling. And the end result was this book. And really, one of the things that I came away from it is, the Hollywood stars really may have been the most innovative bunch in baseball history. There were 2 versions of the Hollywood stars. An earlier one that Bill Lane started and in the early 30s abandoned and moved to San Diego. The second one was the San Francisco club. The mission moved down in 1938 and were a disaster in Los Angeles as the Hollywood Stars. The 38 version of the Hollywood Stars were owned by a banker who went bankrupt, lost some major lawsuits to depositors, and he had to liquidate his holdings. And they were such a bad ball club and in such dire straits financially that at one point in the 38 season, their trunks didn't get loaded on the train for an away game. And thus, with no equipment or uniforms, they had to forfeit the first game of the series in the city that they traveled to. Well, the league fined them, and the Pacific Coast League fined them. And in order to be able to come up with the money to pay the fine, they had to sell a player's contract to raise the money. That's how bad things were. I think historically, the reputation that most of us have carried of the Hollywood Stars is as the celebrity team in baseball. And indeed, they were. When they were sold in '39, it was a group of movie stars, directors, writers, producers that bought the ball club. So in addition to the celebrity ownership, the stands at their ballpark were filled each night with the movie stars. And many ball players that I talked to said that what really stunned them was when they joined the Hollywood club, were either traded for or purchased. On arriving, they found these movie stars, the biggest stars in the industry, were as big a fans of them as they were these movie stars. And the movie stars weren't just ticket buying fans, they were very actively involved. On a bat day, you would have Gary Cooper and Bing Crosby and Barbara Stanwyck at the turnstile passing out the souvenir bats. It was a very intimate ballpark, Gilmore Field, and the players would be carrying on conversations with Jimmy Stewart and his kids and a number of others in the stands that were very avid fans. Jimmy Stewart routinely invited players to his home for dinner. Gail Patrick, who was married to the owner of the ball club, she would routinely have pool parties at her estate after she divorced the team owner with a later husband on her big estate. She would have barbecues and pool parties and invite the players and their families out. Bing Crosby would take players golfing. So it was a really unique environment. And then when the celebrity ownership group came in, they really changed a lot of things about baseball. And that celebrity group, the guy at the head of that whole thing and the guy that really instigated a lot of the change was someone that he may have touched your life and you don't even realize it. His name was Bob Cobb. And the way he touched your life was Bob Cobb was the owner of probably the most celebrated restaurant in the world at that time, the Brown Derby in Hollywood. And he was the inventor of the Cobb salad. But Bob Cobb had the opportunity through his attorney to purchase the ball club and immediately got on the phone and made calls to a number of his celebrity friends. And within just a few hours had the money raised to be able to buy the club. And they sold shares at $7,500 a share. Each person was only allowed to purchase one share. And they raised a little over $200,000. $40,000 of that went to buy the ball club. About $50,000 went to improve what had been a horrible ball club. And then $100,000 was set aside and matched by a local developer and oil man, Earl Gilmore. And they built, for $200,000, built a 10,000 seat ballpark, Gilmore Field, which was right next door to Gilmore Stadium, the football stadium. When they bought the ball club, the manager of the club had already left town to go to New Orleans for the winter meetings and knew he was going to have no money to be able to buy ball players. But when he arrived, he received a telegram from Cobb explaining that there was $50,000 in the coffers to spend. And the first player he went out and bought was Bill Sissel, the former White Sox second baseman, who had been traded at the end of the 38 season to the Giants. Giants had a lot of injury issues, and Sissel finished the 38 season playing for New York. But the Giants didn't have any, he wasn't in their plans going forward, so they sold him to Hollywood. And Sissel became very popular with the movie stars. In that 39 season, the first season of the celebrity ownership group, Sissel got into a beef with an umpire. He was fined, And then he blasted the president of the Pacific Coast League, called him incompetent, drew another fine, and a bunch of movie stars led by Barbara Stanwyck and her husband, Robert Taylor, they chipped in money and they paid the fine for it. Right within hours of buying Sissel, they purchased a contract with Babe Herman. And I contend that those two, really Herman in particular, changed that club, because Cobb understood, being married to Gail Patrick at the time, he understood star power, the Paramount studio model. And bringing in Babe Herman, who was such a well-known and popular figure in Southern California from his high school days, it brought a huge name, it brought credibility, and it really improved the talent of the ball club. Herman was a big star for Hollywood for 5 years, retired in a salary spat, and then came back out of retirement during the war and finished up with Brooklyn. But those two players really helped to kind of turn the reputation of the franchise around. A lot of the players also, that whole celebrity element of it, they got involved in the movies. A number of players, when you watch movies, whether it's the Stratton Story, whether it's Kill the Umpire, the extras in a lot of those baseball films are players with the Hollywood Stars. Irv Noren shared with me the story that he was one of a group of players that was an extra, and I believe the movie was Kill the Umpire. And the last scene they were going to shoot in this particular day was a scene where Noren was to make a throw from center field to third base. Well, Noren intentionally airmailed the throw way over the head of the third baseman so that they would have to shoot the scene again the next day, and all the players would be brought back and get another day's pay. So they figured it out pretty quick. But there were a number of baseball movies that involved a lot of the Hollywood players. And then as television came about, they got opportunities on television, game shows and some of the shows there. To what Jack was talking about also, yes, Charlie Root during the war years was the player manager at Hollywood. He had one terrific season and then tapered off his next season and was let go. But he was approached about being involved in the Babe Ruth film. He not only did he turn it down, but he went to court to block that scene and his name from being used in the film. And they ultimately, if you look at that scene, it is a left-hander that is on the mound pitching in that particular scene, and Root's name is not mentioned. Root did contend. George Genovese told me he had many conversations with Charlie, and there were other players that shared with me, and also in many of the Los Angeles papers, there were notes about it during the years Charlie was the manager. But he did contend vehemently that it was not a called shot, that Ruth, because he got 2 quick strikes on Ruth, Ruth had 2 fingers up noting that. The Cubs dugout was really riding him, and he was giving it back to them. And Root said he snapped off a curveball that was probably a little above ankle high, and couldn't believe how hard and how far Ruth hit the baseball. But even Babe Herman, Root's line was, if I had known that he had called that shot, I would have put the baseball in his ear. And Babe Herman, who was a real close friend of Root, seconded that. He said 5 times in my career, he's taken that little felt thing off the top of my cap, and he's my best friend. But a lot of the players did get opportunities in films, and many of them thought they could parlay it into a career in films. And no Hollywood star player ever did. Only a Los Angeles Angel player by the name of Chuck Connors, their first baseman in 1951. There were a lot of casting agents as well as directors, writers, producers at the games. And Connors struck up a friendship with a casting agent. And George Genovese, in fact, shared the story. He and Chuck grew up, knew each other in New York, played against each other in high school and in other minor leagues before they got to the Pacific Coast League. And George told the story that in 51, he drew a walk. And when he got to first base, Connors came over, patting the glove, said, George, I'm getting into pictures. I got a deal. I'm going to be in a picture. And he had been contracted to do Pat and Mike, the Spencer Tracy film. But what was really unique that I found about the club was the innovations. Bob Cobb went into this knowing and understanding celebrities. He had to, because of his restaurant. He had learned at the restaurant that if the celebrities were not happy, they wouldn't complain. They just wouldn't come back. And he knew that you had to be consistent, you had to have quality, and you had to involve them, you had to engage them. And some of the actors, he would put their favorite dish on the specials menu. Pat O'Brien's Irish Stew, things of that nature. So he carried that with him to the ballpark, and he was all about quality. And he clashed with the food service company he contracted, because obviously they were about buying in bulk, buying cheap, selling high, and he was about quality. He had a certain type of hot dog he wanted, for instance. He was a stickler for the fat count of the ice cream, and he and his wife clashed over that. So he was really a stickler for quality. The boxes in Gilmore Field were not just your typical ballpark boxes. They had backing, they had siding, a little bit of privacy for the box seat holders. Beneath the stands, he built a VIP lounge. We're talking years before the Lakers and their Showtime celebrity lounge at the Forum in Los Angeles. Paul Pettit was telling me how he was given a tour. The pitcher, this very celebrated pitcher, when he was a senior in high school, the scout for Hollywood brought him through Gilmore Field for a game, and he said it was kind of amazing to go into the VIP lounge, and they had a live band, they had a buffet meal, they had an open bar. And then I asked Paul some details, and he said, I really can't tell you. He says, I was mesmerized by the woman on George Raft's arm. So that was his lasting memory. Many of the players dated actresses. Many of the top actresses in the industry were there night in, night out. On a talk I did a while back to a Kiwanis Club in Pasadena, I was telling the story that Hollywood year in and year out did a beauty pageant, and many ball clubs did in the 1950s. But what was different about Hollywood's beauty pageant was the studios would enter the young actresses they had just put on contract as a way to get them some exposure and publicity. Well, in 1956, Miss Hollywood Stars was Jane Mansfield. And as I told that story, a woman in the Kiwanis Club in Pasadena chimed in and said, I'm so glad you told that story, because I was once one of those movie starlets. And she told of George Raft escorting her to a couple of games. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing giving this talk. I'd much rather hear your stories. But so it was a really unique and special environment. There are several things that we see in baseball today. In fact, I, with a friend, last time I was at Wrigley Field, took a picture of it, intending to use it in the book, but my picture didn't turn out as good as another photo I used. But one of the things we see in baseball all the time today is that middle inning pause where they come out and groom the infield. And that was created by the Hollywood Stars back in 1950. The Stars were, they had a pitcher by the name of Jack Salveson. And Jack was near the end of his career. He had been with the Giants, and at that point, he didn't have the great stuff he had in the big leagues. And to get by and succeed, he felt like he had to keep the hitters off balance. And so to do that, Jack worked very, very quick. And he would tell his catcher, as soon as you throw the ball to me, be right back down in the crouch, because the next pitch is coming. Well, the games that Jack pitched were generally a half hour shorter in duration than any other Hollywood game, which meant they didn't make as much money at the concession stands. And so the powers that be with Hollywood were racking their heads trying to think of how they were going to get around that. And the idea they came up with was to create a mid-game intermission, a 10-minute intermission, and have the grounds crew come out and regroom the infield. Well, they ran the idea by the Pacific Coast League, and they were denied. They took it up with the commissioner's office and was denied. And then they took it up with the Baseball Rules Committee, which gave them an opportunity to do it on an experimental basis over the second half of the 1950 season. They did, and by 1951, every team in baseball had adopted this, and it's been in the game ever since. Of course, the Hollywood Stars are very well known for their 1950 introduction of a new unique uniform, short pants. And that was quite an event. Fred Haney was the manager. He had read a column in the Los Angeles Times in which the columnist kind of challenged the Stars to take advantage of the unique costume designers that the studios had, and to come up with a unique creative uniform. Well, Fred Haney jumped on that idea, and the next season called the team in for a meeting in the clubhouse. And with the clubhouse man, they opened up the first box and brought out a pair of short pants. And I talked to the bat boy, Sandy Oster, about it and asked him what the reaction was. He said there was a lot of anger in that room. And I asked him who the angriest were, and he said, well, that was easy. It was the guys with the ugliest legs. But Haney not only came up with the short pants, but what hasn't gotten as much attention is that the top. The top was just a T-shirt. And Haney sold it to his players on the fact that it was going to be much, much lighter than the heavy flannel jersey, and that it would make them faster. So the very first game they played, Chuck Stevens was the leadoff hitter, and Chuck beat out an infield hit. And Fred Haney was coaching first base. He turned to the stands, raised his arms, and shouted, "See, I told you, they worked." And the players had real mixed feelings about it. On the road, it was a crowd. It was a ticket seller. They, in many markets where they went, they got bigger crowds because they wanted to see these unique uniforms. When they went up to Seattle the first time, and the Stars came out on the field in their flannels, the fans booed. They were really angry. And Haney explained afterwards that too cold. They're only going to wear the shorts when the weather is conducive. When they went to Oakland first time, they came out and started the game in the shorts. But after that first inning, players came back in the dugout and said, "Skip, we're freezing out here." And he let them go change into the flannels. And when they came back out, fans were really upset about it. Fred Haney employed a running game. He loved to steal. He loved to hit and run. In the 1949 season, when they won the pennant, 10 times he won games with squeeze plays. So that meant a lot of sliding. And with short pants, it meant a lot of chewed up legs. And Carlos Bernier was his big base stealer, along with Tommy Saffel. And they were really riding Fred pretty good to get rid of the shorts. And after a couple of seasons, he started to phase them out. And after the fourth season, they were a thing of the past. We see ballparks all around, minor and major league parks, as well as county fairs, where one of their marketing tools each year is a new, unique food item. Well, the Hollywood Stars started that back in 1939. Every year, they would introduce something new and unique at the concession stand. One year, it might be fresh-made mini donuts, a bag of a half a dozen of them. Another year, it might be hot, fresh peanuts with a prize in every bag. My favorite was the electrocuted Frankfurter. That was their grand scheme idea one particular season. So they were always innovative, trying new, unique things. But the one lasting thing that traces back to the Hollywood Stars that we see in baseball today is Dodger Stadium. Coming out of World War II, the Pacific Coast League made the first of its 3 attempts to gain major league status. And the first couple of times, Happy Chandler just kind of blew it off. But when Ford Frick became the commissioner, he took it a little bit more seriously. And he developed criteria for every level of professional baseball. And to gain major league status, there were certain requirements in terms of your market size, in terms of your attendance over a 3-year period, and also in terms of the size and the quality of your ballpark. That last part was the sticking point for the Pacific Coast League. The Los Angeles Angels, they were owned by the Wrigleys. They played in the original Wrigley Field, built in 25, named Wrigley Field the year before Cubs Park changed its name to Wrigley Field. And it was very close in terms of being like Wrigley Field. It seated 21,000, double deck. And the feeling was that that passed for major league quality. Steel Stadium in San Francisco needed some work, but it was close, but none of the other parks in the Coast League came close at all. So Cobb was always looking at what he might do to try and come up with a new ballpark. The other problem Cobb had was after the 57 season, his lease on Gilmore Field was going to expire. And Earl Gilmore was having issues. His oil wells were drying up, and he was getting more into property ownership and development and management. So he was starting to sell off parcels of his land. He had already torn down his football stadium, Gilmore Stadium, and sold that to CBS. And in that deal, CBS gained options on other parcels of Earl Gilmore's land, and that included Gilmore Field. So Bob Cobb was really concerned that there was a distinct possibility that he was going to have to play somewhere else after the 57 season. One day he was invited up to the hills to the police academy. The police chief wanted to put in a catering facility in the police academy, wanted his advice, so he went up there. He had been given permission by the police chief to come and shoot anytime he wanted at the range, and Cobb was an avid sportsman, competed in competitive trap and skeet shooting events. And so he took the chief up on that. But when he went up the first time, after meeting with the chief, he went and walked around the hills there. And he came away convinced that he had found the ideal spot for a ballpark. And he went and got a noted sports historian, took him up the next day. The man agreed that they had stumbled on the ideal place for a ballpark. Cobb then engaged a very noted architect, Styles O. Clements. Among his works are the celebrated pool gym in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. So Styles O. Clements then designed what's called a super modern ballpark. It had escalators from the parking lot up to the box offices and the turnstiles. It had 2 restaurants in the design, a bar, childcare, and it had a concept that was very unique for the time. It's very common now, but not back then. They called them cabanas, but we now know them as suites. They went to the city, and the city wasn't really interested. They doubted the Coast League's ability to gain major league status. They went to the county. The county was interested, but not on that site. And Cobb was insistent that it was that site or no site. And he developed a financing plan and continued trying to get approval. But ultimately, Walter O'Malley ended up taking control of the Los Angeles Angels in 1956, and everybody knew what that meant, that at the end of the 57 season, the Brooklyn Dodgers were coming west. When Walter O'Malley came out to Los Angeles, there was a line a mile long of politicians and civic leaders that wanted to meet with him, and he told them that he will not meet with anyone until he first meets with Bob Cobb. They spent a couple of hours in Mr. O'Malley's suite at the old Stadler Hilton Hotel, and Cobb laid out the drawings of the ballpark. He laid out maps of the area showing that 3 freeways would one day service that area. And Walter O'Malley came out of that meeting and he said, "I've learned more from this man in 30 minutes than I have in all the years of all the politicians from Los Angeles lobbying me to bring my club to the West Coast." And he, from that point on, insisted that his ballpark had to be built in Chavez Ravine. There were efforts to try to force him to go into Wrigley Field, and he said that was a non-starter. Others wanted him to play in the Coliseum, and he said, short-term okay, but not long-term. And he stuck to his guns and ultimately got his ballpark in Chavez Ravine. There's always been a great Chicago connection with the Pacific Coast League teams in Los Angeles. As I mentioned, the Wrigley connection, William Wrigley buying the Angels, which he owned for many, many years, holding spring training first on Catalina Island, and then playing their exhibition games in Wrigley. After William Wrigley passed, his son PK took control of the ball club. And of course, that was a Cubs farm team for many, many years. With Hollywood, off and on, they had a relationship with the White Sox. And part of that was the man that Cobb made their first business manager, a guy named Oscar Reichow. Oscar had been a newspaper man in Chicago, covered the Cubs, and was one of the leading proponents of Judge Landis for the commissioner's job. He actually met with Judge Landis and encouraged him to pursue it, and wrote about it in the Sporting News and in newspaper columns. And when Landis was hired, it was kind of derisively mentioned, oh, he was the guy that newspaper guy in Chicago pushed. But Reichow would always come out to Southern California to cover Cubs spring training. And at one point, Wrigley often asked him for advice, and ultimately asked him if he would come in and run the Angels, which he did. After his passing and PK took over, there was a falling out. PK had his own people that he wanted to put in charge. And when Cobb and the celebrity group bought the Stars, he immediately hired Reichow as his business manager. And Reichow was a very innovative guy. There were a lot of things that he brought to the table, one of which was they created their own minor league. The California League, which has been in baseball for 80 years, was created by the Hollywood Stars. It was the idea of Oscar Reichow. He sold it to Bob Cobb. They wanted the Coast League to have their own minor league, and they got it started just before World War II. They had to put it on hold during World War II. When they came back, the owners of those California League teams had already really been seduced by big league clubs who offered more money, and they turned their back on the Coast League, and so the California League became more of a major league farm club league than it was for the Pacific Coast League clubs. But Hollywood's association with the White Sox for a few years brought them one of their great sluggers, Gus Cernial, a guy who I got to know for many years here in Fresno. I succeeded him doing sports on the station here in town. But Gus, coming out of the Navy, was purchased by Hollywood, had a huge year in 1948. And as part of their agreement with the White Sox, the Sox had right of first refusal on Hollywood players, and they snapped up Gus Cernial, and terrific big league career ensued. So there was and of course, Charlie Root, being their manager. Charlie had somewhat retired to, he had a 100,000 acre farm in Central California. He was a big cattle rancher, but his time with Hollywood was very interesting, to say the least. He pitched in the All-Star game in the Coast League and had a really good year. I believe it was in 43. And one of the reasons they ended up firing him wasn't all about the losses in his second year, but he had a habit of chewing out his players while standing in front of the dugout and using a lot of profanity. And so a lot of the box holders went to management of the Stars and said, we're not going to tolerate this. And they went to Charlie and a couple of times asked if he would tone it down. And it just was a habit that didn't get changed. So Charlie got changed. But anyway, it's a remarkable team in the long history of baseball. Their fortunes on the field changed when they tied up with Brooklyn in 49. Fred Haney was the instigator of that. And that began a tremendous friendship between Bob Cobb and Branch Rickey. Cobb initially didn't want to work with Rickey, but once they did, they became great friends. They went on fishing trips together, hunting trips together. And after Rickey was forced out by the Pirates, Hollywood followed him to Pittsburgh, became a Pirates farm club. When Rickey was forced out in Pittsburgh, Bob Cobb made him the chairman of the board of the Hollywood Stars. Little known fact, Branch Rickey was the chairman of the Hollywood Stars for a couple of seasons. 57, when at the end of the 57 season, they knew it was inevitable. They were done. They had a grandiose send-off, and the fans gave Cobb a huge standing ovation. In their last home game, he broke into tears knowing it was over. He tried to keep the club. Long Beach was building a ballpark that is now a college park, Blair Field. There was some effort to try and move the Stars there, but the Coast League didn't want to do it. And Cobb was pretty much forced into selling the Soldier Group in Salt Lake City. And I believe they are the club that is now the Tacoma Rainiers in the Pacific Coast League. I think that's the club that their origins were, the Hollywood Stars that left after the 57 season. So it was, as I'm sure Jack would agree, you get into these things. I think different for Jack falling in love in his project. For me, the tough part was spending a lot of time and developing friendships with these ball players, George Genovese, Paul Pettit, Irv Noren, many, many others. And of course, they were up there in their 80s and some in their 90s when we spent a lot of time together. And they were very excited about the book and very excited about the prospect of the story being told. And we had planned a big get together on the Gilmore property there in Southern California. And sadly, with COVID, we couldn't do it. But even more sadly, several of these guys, before the book came out, passed away. And that was really the tough part, the real heart-tugging part of this project. But it was great fun, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about it and share some of the stories. And if there's questions or comments or thoughts, I'm wide open.
Great. Thank you again for your presentation. Lovely to dig into that. Quick thing, I see the book behind you and a jacket hanging up. What's the...
This is the book, Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball. Roman and Littlefield is the publisher. Wonderful people to work with. It's on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, roman.com, their website. The jacket, you're going to get me emotional here. One of the amazing things of this is family members of Hollywood players that have reached out that have just amazed me and amazed me with the gifts that they've sent out of their gratitude. I've had hats sent, trading cards, pictures, family mementos from kids and grandkids of Hollywood players. And the one that I'm still dumbfounded by was the gift from a family member of that warm-up jacket from the 1940s. It's an actual Hollywood Stars warm-up jacket, which I'm just floored by. So I thought I would create a prop.
Yeah. Wonderful. So yeah, so if anybody, same thing as we did with Jack, if anybody has any questions, feel free, either enter it in the chat, I'll read it, or unmute yourself and fire away.
Dan, when you wear the jacket, do people ever comment on it who might know about the team?
You know, I've gone through the jacket, and the person that sent it to me did not know the history of it. But you know, I've been around baseball enough to know that usually there's that manufacturer label in it, and the players will write their number or their initials, and there's nothing like that in there. So I haven't been able to find the history of it, and I haven't had it long. So I want to do a little bit more digging.
I like your mention of Charlie Root and going to court. I had no idea that he did that. That's a great story.
Found that in an article in one of the LA papers. I was really surprised. You know, that's how adamant he was about that. Whether and it doesn't, to me, it doesn't. I mean, my leanings toward the validity or whatnot tend to have been swayed by the people I've talked with. But when you think about it, it doesn't tell us the truth, and really only Jack and only Charlie and Babe really know. Only Babe really knows. But yeah, I was kind of amazed by that. It shows kind of the veracity Jack had. Jack, I apologize, but had that Charlie Root had about that whole incident.
Yeah, and I saw the note from Mark. Absolutely, Boston guys can certainly hang out with the Chicago crew anytime. So glad to have you. Yeah. So any other questions?
Dan, maybe a question here about Chavez Ravine. If it was a police shooting zone there, how did the Dodgers arrange for the ownership or lease of the property?
Well, it's still there, actually. It's been there for decades. It's down the hill and a little bit to the east of where the ballpark is. You know, the area is a very hilly area. And so the ballpark, if you're coming off of Sunset, now I'm getting my directions all screwed up, but there is one entry into the area, into the ballpark area, that takes you past the police academy, and then you go up the hill. So yeah, it's a few hundred yards away from the entry to the parking lot. And I've never been on the range to see how it's configured and to know what way they're shooting or what they're shooting into.
I guess I'm asking who owned the actual property that the Dodgers were able to.
It was public land. They had originally they wanted to, you know, coming out of World War II, there was such massive growth in Los Angeles, and they lacked housing. In fact, it affected Hollywood, their ability to get players. They had players quit in 45 and 46 because they couldn't find a place to live. They had a manager that wanted to live in a trailer on the property, and Earl Gilmore kicked him off. They had 3 players that lived in the clubhouse because they couldn't find any apartments or rent any space in a house. So housing and materials were one of the big problems as well. But Los Angeles owned that property, and they wanted to create a big housing development up there. So, and there's been a lot, and I'm not going to get into it, Bruce, but there's been a lot, and there's a recent book about, you know, the eviction of the people of Mexican American ancestry from that area to build Dodger Stadium. And from all the documents I came across and the articles I read, probably 85–90% of the people living up there had already been evicted in order to build this housing project. Well, the housing project never happened, and I didn't follow that thread to know the history of why and where it ended up going. But yeah, that was all city property up there. I hope that answered it. My question though is what is the breed and how old is the dog?
Sorry, I jumped on mute as quick as I could there. So
those was actually my 2 pugs. They both jumped up and started licking me madly. So both black pugs, about 6 years old.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Again, this is where I remind everybody this is recorded, so that moment was captured forever. So
that's good.
Perfect. So other questions?
So Dan, at one point the Pacific Coast League had an open classification.
Right.
What did that mean?
Well, it was part of their it was part of their quest for major league status, and it was part of the Ford Frick and his group's effort to try and create that criteria. And one of the things that they ended up settling on, because Hollywood was threatening to go outlaw and just withdraw from the minor leagues altogether. And so the resolution to that was to create a classification really above the highest level of the minor leagues and the major leagues. And so the Pacific Coast League was the only minor league that had that open classification. And that was why it was created. I mean, I can get really deep into it, but one of the big issues was that 5-year draft, which they still have in the minor leagues. And the Coast League owners felt like they were on the West Coast, the high school ball, the college ball was really good, particularly in Southern California. And they wanted the ability to hang on to those young prospects. And because like Hollywood had 3 farm clubs scattered all around the West, and most of the teams in the Coast League had similar arrangements. So they were getting these 17 and 18-year-old kids and some really good young players and trying to develop them. Well, they felt like by the time those kids were going to start helping them at the big league level or at the Pacific Coast League level, they were eligible for the draft. They were going to lose them. And they did lose some really good young prospects. Todd Davis was a really good shortstop. He ended up going to the A's and got hurt. Carl Cox was another one. He ended up getting hurt. So they were trying to get the rule changed. Some club owners wanted more money. I think you got $10,000 if your player was drafted. They wanted to kick up to 25. The big league clubs wouldn't go for it. But a number of the owners just wanted it abolished altogether. They wanted to be able to hang on to these players. And it was really Hollywood's attorney that came up with the solution. And every player from that point on was offered 2 contracts, a white one and a yellow contract. If you took the white contract, that meant you wanted to be made available for the draft. If you took the yellow contract, you were basically giving the big leagues the finger. You wanted to stay in the Coast League. And the first year it was offered, there were only 3 players that signed the white contract that they wanted to be made available in the draft. So I hope that answered you, Ed.
Yep.
Thanks.
Other than Chuck Connors, were there other players who didn't want to go to the majors because they wanted to stay on the West Coast?
Well, there were a lot of them. I mean, George Genevieve shared with me that, after the 49 season, he was picked in the Rule 5 draft by the Washington Senators. And when he went back to negotiate contract, they were offering him $5,000, which at that time was the major league minimum. And he said, but I made over $6,000 playing in the Coast League. And they said, do you want to play in the big leagues or not? And that was what he and Irv Noren, who also went to Washington, that was kind of what they faced. But Steve Bilko was one that Steve Bilko was perfectly happy in LA. He was very well compensated, probably the biggest sports star in LA at that time. Those 3 seasons he was with the Angels. So yeah, there were guys that were perfectly happy and wanted to stay in the Coast League,
even though they were playing 220 games rather than 150.
Well, it seemed to change year in and year out. They went with a standard schedule. Monday was always the universal off day with the travel day. And the Coast League schedule was the games where you played 1 series a week, Tuesday through Sunday, and your Sunday was a day doubleheader. So there were 7 game series over 6 days. And then Monday was your off day. And that was another thing that on the off days, talking about travel, that was something that Hollywood pioneered. They were the first team in baseball to fly. Hollywood, coming out of the war, they were not just flying, but they were using charters. And Hollywood was also the first team outside of the Giants and Dodgers to put their games on television in 1940. So yeah, it was a unique league, a unique situation. And I never heard any of the players complain about the number of games they played.
And the SABR blurb that we got in the email mentions the cheerleaders. Where did they get the cheerleaders from?
They were just local girls. I talked to the
Okay.
son of one of them, and they would perform from time to time on the dugout roof. And had a picture of him in the book as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
neat.
How late are you open?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, very good. Thank you.
they were looking at the entertainment.
Yeah. That's neat, Dan. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'm glad everybody can join us. And again, feel free, if there's one more question, you can go ahead and jump in. Otherwise, I'll wrap today up. So again, thank you to our 2 presenters today, Jack as our leadoff hitter, and
Thanks,
Dan
everybody.
Thank you.
to
Love-
Bad
love
Second
being
today.
here.
So before everybody splits, we have a quick turnaround for our next presentation. We were able to lock down author Dan Epstein. He will be talking about his new book, The Captain and Me, on the 23rd, Saturday the 23rd, so at 2 p.m. Central Time. If you got our last email, it should have the information to register for that. Otherwise, we'll be sending it out again to everybody. So hope we can see you there. Hope you enjoy the postseason. And some of you, I think, have a rooting interest. I'm certainly not one of those for this particular round, but hope the postseason is great, and we'll connect later. So great. Thanks, everybody.
Like it, Ed.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Good presentation.